In January 1963, Dr. King announced that he and the freedom fighters would go to Birmingham, Alabama to fight desegregation laws. The massive protest caught the attention of the entire world, providing what he'd called a coalition of conscience, and inspired his letter from a Birmingham jail. Continuing the fight for civil rights and to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, on August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It was a peaceful protest made up of blacks and whites, young and old. Most had come to hear Dr. King deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. 1964 was a good year for Dr. King and the civil rights movement. During that year, Dr. King was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize as someone who had contributed most to the furtherance of peace among men. During that same year, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, which guaranteed that no person in the United States shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, and later gender, be excluded from participation in, be denied of the benefits of, or be the subject of discrimination. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices that had been responsible for widespread disenfranchisement of African Americans in the United States. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited discrimination in the sales, the rental, and financing of housing on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, and later gender, and physical and mental disabilities. In the 11 years between 1957 and 1968, King traveled over 6 million miles, spoke over 2,500 times, appearing wherever there was injustice, protest, and action, and meanwhile, he wrote 5 books as well as numerous articles. He directed a peaceful march in Washington, D.C., conferred with President John F. Kennedy, and campaigned for Lyndon B. Johnson. King was arrested upwards of 20 times, assaulted at least 4 times. He was awarded 5 honorary degrees and named Man of the Year by Times Magazine in 1963, and became not only the symbolic leader of American blacks, but also a world figure. At the age of 35, King was the youngest man to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And when notified of his selection, he announced that he would turn over the prize money of $54,000 to the furtherance of the civil rights movement. As the leader of the movement, King believed that appeals to the consciousness of white Americans would destroy racism. He believed that in the final analysis, blacks could depend on whites' goodwill to usher in social change. Near the end of his life, King changed his mind about the causes and consequences of racial suffering. He became convinced that racial inequality was entwined with economic roots. He sought to galvanize the poor of all races in a march on Washington, the Poor People's Campaign, it was called, that would be far more creative in disrupting the status quo than the 1963 campaign. King sought to establish social justice by destroying poverty. But as he would discover, the unification of suffering people across lines of race and ethnicity and region would provoke his greatest resistance he had ever encountered, and many argue it is what got him killed. King, however, would not be deterred. In fact, it was his opposition to class oppression that drew him to Memphis as an irresistible testing ground, he argued, for his national assault on poverty. The decision, however, to come to Memphis would prove fatal. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, while standing on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was to lead a march protesting the striking sanitation workers' claim for equal pay, he was assassinated. 43 years after his death, few would have thought that so many have succeeded and so many have been left behind. The civil rights movement broke down doors, lowered barriers, and allowed for many to achieve. However, we know that there were many who were not able to walk through the doors. This presents a paradox. 43 years after his death, the paradox of the movement's legacy is no more apparent than in the social economic gap between the residents of Peoria's South Side and Bradley's University growing African American student body and the nation's first family. By all accounts, the black middle class has doubled since 1965. Indeed, today, 48% of black Americans can claim middle class status. This group is more educated, have better jobs, and a higher standard of living than any other group of black Americans in the nation's history. To the contrary, 8.3% of African Americans are unemployed. 20.3% have no health insurance. 24.4% live in poverty, and 1 out of 8 black men in their 20s are in prison or in jail. And 1 out of 3 black males born today are expected to go to prison. The legislative victories won in the 1960s lowered racial barriers for those who were prepared to take advantage of these increased opportunities, while those without marketable skills and education were left behind. The expanding gulf between the black middle class and the black underclass deeply concerned King, encouraged a retreat in the last years of his life from focusing solely on race when he saw that blacks would continue to suffer if they lacked economic equality. King's class-based analysis of racial inequality materialized in 1965 when he confronted the crises of northern ghettos. King sought to transform urban black centers. But as he discovered, there were tremendous tactical flaws in his endeavor to end racism by focusing only on race. His experience in Chicago proved to be what Michael Eric Dyson called a successful failure, because he and his staff were forced to generate fresh strategies to cope with the harsh realities they unexpectedly met. King was violently dismissed by working class and lower middle class whites who saw the city's growing black population as an economic threat and as competition. Northern society charted a geography of racial separatism informed by codes and unwritten rules. There was no need to name black and white water fountains, restaurants, or department stores in Chicago. The different communities that made up the city's population, as in Peoria and Bloomington and Cleveland and Detroit, just to name a few, operated along invisible racial lines that marked safe and dangerous territories. The threat of white violence and at times black retaliation was and is deeply etched in the psychic map of the residents of these cities. Such fears police social contact much more efficiently and effectively than ever a racist sheriff or a city council member's regulations. The North typography of racial domination revealed huge barriers in King's campaign. King saw that the struggle to free Northern blacks, that King saw that in the struggle to free Northern blacks, race mattered, but class mattered more. By 1964, King had already reached the conclusion that blacks faced what he called basic social and economic problems that required political reform. But the vicious nature of ghetto poverty convinced King that the best hope for America was a redistribution of wealth. In 1967, his presidential address to the SCLC, King urged his colleagues to fight the problems of the ghetto by organizing their economic and political power. He declared that from the old plantations in the South to the newer ghettos in the North, the Negro have been confined to a life of voicelessness and powerlessness. The antidote, he said, was to acquire power that would give the Negro the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. King urged his organization to develop a program that would compel the nation to have a guaranteed annual income, full employment, and thus abolish poverty. He argued that the dislocation of market operations of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrust people into an endless cycle of idleness that bind the constant and frequent unemployment against their will. Advocating for structural change, King preached that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. In a remarkable statement, in a speech he gave to his staff in 1966, King laid out his ideological base for the deepening assault of poverty, economic injustice, and class inequality. King argued that we are now making demands that will cost the nation something. You can't talk about solving economic problems of the Negro without talking about spending billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending slums without first talking about taking the profits out of slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous grounds because now you're messing with folks. You're messing with the captains of industry. Now this means we are trading on difficult waters because it really means we are saying something is wrong. Yes, sir. Something is wrong with capitalism, and there must be a better distribution of wealth. And maybe America must move towards democratic socialism.